3D movie cinema, the only show that's 3 dimensions away from Leatherface being the Joker in the new Robert Pattinson Batman movie. I'm your host, 3D Jake, and today we're looking at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003 remake. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a remake that was directed by Marcus Nipsel, who was produced by Michael Bay under his new production company, Platinum Dunes, which was a production company that was established to produce low-budget horror remakes, with new upcoming directors. And apparently it worked really well. So, which I apologize for the noise, in-laws. But so anyway, I did a collaboration this week, and I really wanted to say, I did it with my buddy Dave, and I'm going to show you his review, then on to mine.
It's Dave from Interpreting the Stars, back on Jacob Collins' channel to discuss yet another classic horror film remake released in the early years of the 21st century, and that is the 2003 remake to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre centers on a group of friends traveling from the Mexican border carrying 2 pounds of marijuana that they had bought across the border when they run into a strange hitchhiker. When that hitchhiker kills herself, their lives are forever changed when they wind up in Podunk, Texas, where a whole lot of weird people greet them, and they all seem to be after one thing: their blood. And one of the strangers trying to kill them is a massive and crazy masked maniac wielding a chainsaw. First of all, I have to give a massive thank you to Jacob for having me on today. It's been a long while since I've sat down to watch any Texas Chainsaw film. It's not exactly my favorite horror franchise, since I've only seen a handful of them. I think I saw the original film, this one, the 3D film, and Leatherface, which I do remember having fun with, but it was never really a series that I watched everything from. And the one that I've seen in the past, I hardly remember anything about them anyway. Just that I saw him at one point, so going into this movie was still a mostly fresh experience on my end, and I have some mixed emotions about it overall. Some good, some bad, so let's start with some of these good moments. First of all, the look of this film is pretty great. There's a grunginess to the film that does a great job showcasing despair and isolation. It really does feel like they're in the middle of nowhere being hunted down versus on a movie set. Another thing about the visuals was the Hewitt house. I went back and I looked at the house from the older film and I saw that it's mostly just a normal house. This was like a huge, ominous, towering home in the middle of nowhere that seems to fit Texas Chainsaw a lot more than the original film did. It's kind of a character in and of itself if you think about it. And whenever you have something that works better than the classics, you kind of have to mention it. The people that played the Hewitts, which is kind of the weird people in town in general, they were all phenomenal and very memorable weirdos. I'd even go as far to say that I liked pretty much every villain in this film. Leatherface was fine, sure, but he didn't seem to be as focused on as everybody else. I mean, weirdly enough, I actually preferred the terrifying and twisted sheriff character than Leatherface himself. I found that to be really interesting. But even the 2 girls in the motor home off in the distance, terrifying people. Whenever you have a diverse set of villains, that seems to authenticate a slasher and make it more of a threat. Because no matter where you go, you're not safe. Doesn't matter if Leatherface is right behind you or not, because somebody else probably is. So I found that to work in the film's favor. Now, onto some negatives. Not a ton, mind you, but our 5 lead characters that are the victims, so to speak, they are the opposite of the Hewitts and not memorable at all. Not only that, but they're not really all that likable either. I mean, they're pretty empty characters, so when they all start getting killed off, you don't care as much as you could. This is a common problem in slasher films, because even though it has a lot of fantastic horror characters, it also has an equal amount of forgettable characters, meaning I cannot give my character score full points, because our heroes drag that score down. I can kind of understand why that is, though. Our leads are all somewhat recognizable cast members, which doesn't always happen with horror films. But that's more of a casting thing, you know? You don't care about the characters, but you might be rooting for, say, Jessica Biel, because it's Jessica Biel, and that's kind of silly. Another problem with the movie is something that's somewhat unavoidable. and that's just the cheese factor. There's a level of cheese that is very prevalent in the early 2000s, and you see that here too. It's not a huge thing, but something that I certainly noticed. So overall, I'd say that if you're a fan of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's a worthy film. At least from what I can remember anyway. I do think it does some things better than the original, like the Hewitt house, like I'm sure some of the moments of gore as well. The first probably does some stuff better too, which is to be expected. But it's not as bad as a remake as some other horror films have run into. I had an okay time with it, so let's break down the score. From a technical, unbiased perspective, I have to give the visuals department props for the cinematography, the grungy feeling of the film, the makeup department for dressing up these people as psychotic. The house is awesome, but the weird thing is, visuals is only one aspect of my score. I go into a bunch of stuff. So even though it did a great job with the visuals and the production design and things like that, that's really the only thing that I have to say specifically when giving it praise. Everything else was more or less business as usual. This score is 68%. As for how I personally felt about the movie, or my bias score, that's a little bit higher because as a horror film, it's not trying to do much of anything other than entertain you, and entertain me, it did. It's nothing crazy, and if I rewatch it, it won't be for another several years. But I'm not against the idea, which is probably the most important thing. This score is 74%, meaning that when we combine the two scores together, we come to the final rating of 71%. 71 out of 100 possible stars. So thank you to Jacob for having me on today to talk about this 2003 remake to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I wish you the best of luck on the rest of your chainsaw endeavors, and I'll send it back your way to talk about the rest of your thoughts on this film. And until we meet again, peace out!
Thanks, Dave, once again. I can't wait to collab with you on more projects. Thanks so much. I am so grateful for you to do this review for me. I'm honored. Thank you so much. Now, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003 was a remake that was directed by Marcus Nipsel under Michael Bay's new production company, Platinum Dunes, who is Michael Bay oversees along with Brad Fuller and Andrew Form, who would go on to remake several other horror IPs. And this movie, they acquired the rights like 1999 or 2000, early 2000s, and the idea was to get established horror projects under direction of new directors. So I think what it is that was the idea. So under this idea is they would remake these movies, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre being one of them, to see it as like a prototype to see if that would work. And the idea was they hired the new writer they hired to write the movie. They hired was a person that were like, look, we don't want it to be the exact same movie. We want to do something different. We want to make it original. And so I think his name was Scott Kazar was the guy who wrote it. Scott Kazar, they hired him to write the movie. And so his idea was, look, I'm going to make it like, kind of similar idea, but like entirely new, like introduce new characters, the family, make the family more of a character rather than just being like, okay, it's like three people and the rest are corpses. And I think that's unique about it, and I really like that about this. And, the family, like Dave touched upon earlier, the family is the characters. The family is. And so I think when you watch this movie, you'll actually kind of see that the family, there's a lot of things that happen in this movie. Like, one thing is, I think Leatherface the movie feels scary. Like, when you get in that house, you feel like Leatherface is actually evil. Like, he actually has an evil look. He's scary, creepily looking. His face is evil. Like, he has that grin on his face. Like, he's not playing around. Like, the scene that always gets me is the scene where, like, where the grandpa is, like, he's like, what you doing in my house? And he's banging on there. He's basically getting Leatherface. He's banging on there. And then Leatherface opens the door up and he cranks that chainsaw up. And I'm like, that scene that gets me every time. Like, that scene is just like, yes. Like, it's phenomenal, that scene. Like, that scene, and then, like, he runs through, like, the sheets, and then he gets the guy in the sheets. And let's not even talk about the sheriff, okay? The sheriff, played by the late, great R. Lee Ermey. He is so evil in this movie. And he only continues with that in the next movie, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the beginning. He in this movie, like, there is one of my favorite lines in the movie. And he says one of my favorite lines in the movie, where he's like, excuse me, son, you mind getting the fuck out of my way? Like, that's one of my favorite lines in the movie. Like, I still to this day feel like that, I quote that line, because that's just so great. That's such a great line. And he literally feels like a character that would live in this world in real life. Like, he feels like a real person. It doesn't feel like, oh, it's over the top. Like, He literally, you like he plays that where you're like, you don't know if this is a good guy or a bad guy, but when you see his true intentions at the closer to the end of the movie, you're like, oh my god, this dude's a psychopath. And I think he gives such a great and elevated performance. Like he literally carries the whole movie. Like he is, like he overshadows Leatherface, and I know a lot of people are like, and that kind of like, like he's such a great character. And then in the second one, they kind of morally embrace that, and he is basically the star of the movie, and Leatherface is a side character. And I will say that they do a great job at that, and I understand, it's called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Leatherface should be the star of the movie, but I mean, I think his performance is so fascinating to where you can't wait to get back to him because you want to see what this dude's going to be next. I mean, he's kind of like the Joker of this movie, like he's crazy and you don't know what he's going to do next. And then at the end, when spoilers, he dies by getting run over by Jessica Biel, you are like rooting because, yes, like he killed that monster. Yes. Because like this dude, literally, if she goes back with that family, that dude's going to torture her and have his way with her because he's a psychopath. And he gets off on doing stuff like this. And he's a psycho. And, and she's going to end up breakfast in the morning. And I think that's what makes it so cool about this movie is that, this is essentially, it's horrifying. Like, because it kind of plays full circle. At the beginning of the movie, they pick up the hitchhiker who would rather kill herself than go back to that family. Because she knows if we go back in this direction, we're going to end up in that family, because the sheriff, he runs the roads, and, the grandma works at the gas station, and then, like, there's nothing around here except for that house, and so we're going to somehow get back in that house, and I'd rather just kill myself, shoot myself in the head, than go back to that family. And I think, and that's so terrifying to where you're like, this girl's just mentally ill, and then you go all the way, and then you realize by the end of the movie, no, that girl's not mentally ill, she would just rather die then go back to that family. And then you see at the end, you're like, when it goes full circle, you're just like, you see this with Jessica Biel where she's trying to stop the trucker from going in that direction. You're like, oh, that's why the girl didn't want to do it at the beginning. Because it's so, it's metaphoric of like, okay, this she was so traumatized. Like, they stole that woman's baby. And then they took, like, the sheriff did horrible, unspeakable things to her. And then on top of that, like, she somehow escaped. And she's, and it's terrifying, and the sad thing is there are people like that in real life that are kind of like that, and it's messed up that we live in a society like this, but at the same time, I think that's what makes it more terrifying in this movie, is that this is almost realistic in a way to where it's like, this really could happen in a way, and this was the 70s, so there's no telling, there might be unsolved cases that this has happened in, and so I think that's one thing why I really appreciate this movie in a lot of ways, is because of that, this uniqueness of it. And so I think when I saw, when Dave was talking about, I think, yeah, like, a lot of people don't like the 74. Let's say, it's just not, like, I always say, it's a good horror film, but this movie is the film that should have been made. So, I always say, like, that's a good indie film. This is a better version of that indie film. This movie is terrifying, and I know some people say, well, the 74 film because it was original. But I feel like this movie did something with that. It found all the flaws in that movie and made it better and made it like, okay, we're going to fix this. But it doesn't want to just redo like a Gus Van Sant remake of Psycho. They're not just doing a shot-for-shot remake. They're actually telling their own take on it. But they're improving the stuff that we wish could have improved back in 74. And I think that's what unique about it. And that's what I love about it. And I kind of, I rewatched it when I was reviewing this. And I was like, it just still holds up. And to where at the end, you're just like, I don't want it to end. And Leatherface, even like so, he makes it sound like it's almost, it feels like supernatural at times because he cuts his leg, and you're like he doesn't scream, and you're like, he would be screaming bloody murder. But then again, look at the original film, that same thing happened, and it does parallel to some things like him cutting his leg, like in the original movie, and he even gets his hand cut off, and like he doesn't really gush that much blood. I'm like, come on, but again, MPA probably said you can't be gushing blood too much. And for the movie called Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there's not a lot of gore in this movie. I mean, there's more gore in the later films in this movie, which is fine because it's focused more on terrifying you than it is on trying to gore you out. Which later sequels and stuff like the next one would focus more on gore and less on scares. But I still like that one too, just like I like this one. I think this movie really is a good, solid remake. Like a lot of when me and Dave were reviewing Hills Have Eyes, we both talked about Hills Have Eyes is good. But the original one, the remake is so much better. Just like with Texas Chainsaw. The original one's good, but the remake is so much better. And that's not a lot you can say. Like, there's a lot of remakes that are terrible compared to the original, but this one is one that's such a great film. I urge you to go see it if you've never watched it. Watch it. I think it's on Netflix. And here's a funny story. People that are wanting to see the new film are thinking the 2003 one is the original movie, so they're watching this one and they're loving it, and then they're watching that one and going, what went wrong with this? It's just, I thought that was funny. I've been seeing a lot of that because Netflix doesn't have the rights to the 74 film, so they're watching the 2003 one thinking the 74 film is the 2003 one, so I thought that was funny to share. But if I had to give this movie a grade, I would give it a solid A-.